Stock. I'm an attorney at Cascadia Cross-Border Law Group in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm also a retired lieutenant colonel in the military police in the Army, and I currently practice immigration and citizenship law almost exclusively, but I do a lot of work with military members and asylum seekers. So I was asked to speak to you folks about the current state of immigration law in Alaska, and I have a slide presentation. Are you able to see that?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, that'll help. Okay, so I want to focus my talk mostly on Alaska because we're all Alaskans and we have a unique history here in Alaska that impacts the current state of immigration law in our fair state. And I usually start off by telling people that we're a very unique state in a number of ways, immigration wise. One interesting little unique fact is that Alaska is the only state in the whole entire union that has ever had an undocumented immigrant as its governor. People always are surprised to hear that, but we had a territorial governor named John Franklin Strong, and the President of the United States appointed him to be our territorial governor without checking his papers first. And it turned out he was not an American citizen, which nobody knew at the time. And it was discovered that he was an undocumented immigrant when his other wife showed up looking for him from Canada. In addition to not being a U.S. citizen, he had two wives at the same time, and one of them came looking for him. So he then fled our fair state in disgrace and was no longer our territorial governor. So I thought that might interest folks because long ago they weren't checking people's papers before making him the territorial governor of Alaska, which is kind of interesting. So immigration has been part of our national history for a very, very long time. I thought I'd show you one of the cartoons. There's tons of these cartoons, but this is the Native American saying, time to get serious on immigration issues when the immigrants started showing up on our shores. And our immigration problems and concerns date way back. I think you have a rally coming up, and you might be interested to know that the Declaration of Independence addresses immigration. One of the grievances we had against King George way back when was that he was limiting immigration to the colonies. And that was a grievance that was higher up on the scale than the grievance about taxes. Most Americans know that the colonists were upset about taxes, but they were more upset if you look at the priorities that the king was preventing the population of the states and obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners and refusing to let them migrate to the United States. And so that grievance was actually way, way higher up on the list of grievances on the Declaration of Independence than most Americans are aware of today because it's just not something our national leadership talks about. But 250 years ago, we were concerned about immigration. And we also had people that were anti-immigration back then. These are some quotes from a famous founding father of the United States. I thought these might interest you. I haven't put the name of the founding father up there yet, but I thought you'd take a look at the quotes. He thought immigrants were coming who were stupid and they weren't used to liberty. And he was particularly suspicious of Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes, whom he called swarthy people. And the Germans in particular, he was upset about at the time. He thought only the Saxons were worthy of immigration to the United States. If you don't know who this was, it was Benjamin Franklin. And it was actually before our country was founded. He was pretty upset about the Germans in particular. He thought they were refusing to learn English, hanging out in Pennsylvania and speaking German. And this was not good for the future of America, that the immigration of the Germans should be heavily limited. I find that interesting from an Alaska perspective because Germans historically were the largest group of immigrants to Alaska in historical perspective, including our current president's ancestors who came to Alaska during the gold rush period. And some of you may know that from reading articles in the Anchorage Daily News that the Trump family had immigrated at one point to Alaska during the gold rush before they changed their name to Trump. And the president became descended from them. So way back when we had immigration debates going on, but in our Declaration of Independence, we came out on the side of being pro-immigration. There's a lot of history between then and now, but the last president we had who was pro-immigration was Ronald Reagan. After Ronald Reagan, the presidents generally became tougher and tougher on immigration. Bill Clinton, in particular, was pretty tough. He signed one of the worst, most restrictive immigration laws in American history. Barack Obama, thought to be pro-immigrant, wasn't actually that pro-immigrant. He was pretty tough on immigrants. Biden, contrary to popular belief, was pretty tough on immigrants, although more liberal probably than Obama had been. But the last president we had who was super pro-immigrant was Ronald Reagan. And that was a very long time ago. But the last major immigration reform package that went through the United States Congress was during Ronald Reagan's tenure as president. It was the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And at the time, Reagan thought there was a big immigration problem, mainly caused by the fact that people could not become legal. He was concerned that the immigration system wasn't fair and it wasn't allowing people a natural legal process for them to get a green card. So he wanted people to be allowed to get a green card. He thought the laws were too tough and too restrictive, and there weren't enough ways for people to become legal. So he pushed really hard for a reform, and he did end up getting one through Congress. And I like to show people a picture of the three-legged stool because this is what they used to describe it as. Reagan got Congress to agree on a reform that was supposed to be the solution to illegal immigration. And one leg of the stool was going to be something that everybody called an amnesty. So they were going to give green cards to people who met certain requirements but had been in the country without papers. Basically, as long as they weren't terrorists and criminals, they were going to be allowed to get legal status. They wouldn't get citizenship. They would just get a temporary green card and then they could try to convert that to a permanent green card. But he wanted a big amnesty program for millions of people to try to legalize their status. And then, second, he wanted border security. That was part of the compromise. They wanted to make it tougher for people to come into the US because at that time it was extremely easy for people to come into the United States without papers. And millions of people were doing this all the time. It was not considered any big deal. But they would end up in the US without papers and they'd be working, and there was no law that prohibited them from working in the United States if they didn't have papers. And the thinking was that there was the jobs magnet was getting people to come to America, that most people were coming because they wanted to work here. And that wasn't fair to Americans born in America, that they should be allowed to have priority for the jobs. So the thinking was if we ramp up border security, we'll be able to stop people from coming in illegally. And they talked about doing things like adding more border patrol agents to the border and trying to stop people to come from coming in unlawfully. Because the southern border had been pretty much more or less open. And this allowed people from other countries to come in and work and then go back home and come in and work and go back home. And there had been a cycle of, especially people from Mexico, but also people from other countries who would just come up north without visas and they would work in the fields and then they would make money and they would just go back home. And this had been going on for decades and decades, despite it technically not being legal. So Reagan said, we're going to ramp up the border security and stop that from happening. And then the third thing he did with Congress was to create a system where employers in the United States were required to verify whether somebody was allowed to work. Up until 1986, no U.S. employer was required to check the legal status of anybody working for them. You could hire anybody you wanted to. You didn't have to check their papers. And anybody who managed to get into the country could work. And there was no federal law that prevented them from working for any employer. They might be violating immigration law somehow, but the employer wasn't required to check their papers. So for decades and decades, immigrants would come into America and they wouldn't come in legally necessarily, but as soon as they got here, they were allowed to work, and they would work. So, for example, I recently looked at a transcript of an Irish immigrant from the 1930s who had wanted to work in the United States. And so he got a free passage to Canada because the Irish were allowed to get a free boat ride to Canada. And then he and a group of his compatriots, all fellow Irish people, went up to the border near Buffalo. And there was only one border agent there. So they decided to rush the border agent to get into the United States. And these Irish immigrants all rushed the border agent and got into the United States, except for this one guy who got caught because the border agent could only grab one person. So there's a transcript of his deportation hearing where he was talking about how they all went up to the northern border and they rushed the border agent, and everybody got in except for him, and he was caught, and they were all going to go down and get jobs at Bethlehem Steel. And there was nothing wrong at the time with them going and getting jobs at Bethlehem Steel as long as they got into the country. So Reagan said we got to stop that jobs magnet that's getting people to come here without lawful status. And we're going to make it for the first time in American history in 1986. Every U.S. employer has to verify the legal status of all their workers. And the federal government set up a giant bureaucracy to do this with a Form I-9 and a whole system for teaching employers in America how to tell the different statuses people have so they could figure out if they were allowed to work. And this was, again, part of this compromise that was supposed to solve the immigration problem. But Reagan wanted one thing that he didn't get, and he didn't get it because Congress wouldn't give it to him. And that was he wanted a reform of the immigration laws so that they were logical and that they allowed people to come in legally and get green cards and then citizenship. And he couldn't get Congress to do that part of the three-legged stool. He also couldn't get Congress really to fund the border security until relatively recently. So overall, he got an amnesty for immigrants. He got U.S. employers to be required to verify the work status of their workers. They had some border security, but overall, they didn't solve the immigration problem. And it was mainly because of Congress. Congress just wouldn't fix the laws. And I can tell you from being an immigration lawyer for several decades now that immigration law is a mess as a system of law. It makes no sense. It's illogical. It's arbitrary. And it is that way because of Congress. Congress keeps passing laws that don't make any sense and that conflict with other laws. But this cartoon pretty much illustrates it. Congress will say illegal immigration is an issue, but they won't do anything about it. And then they'll say it's a problem and they won't do anything about it. It's a crisis and they won't do anything about it. And the joke is wake us up when it's a catastrophe so we can do something. But even today, they haven't fixed the immigration laws. In fact, they just keep getting worse and harder to understand and comply with. So Reagan started doing something that everyone blames Biden for doing. He started using his executive power to deal with the immigration issues. And somebody said, well, won't that set a bad precedent? And he said, what's the worst that could happen? Well, back then, he didn't predict what we have going on today, which is a president who's decided to take executive action to the extreme. And that has become the norm in immigration law, where the presidents can't get Congress to do anything. So they decide to just act on their own without congressional authority because they can't get Congress to do anything. And previously, some presidents were being more liberal on this issue, so they were acting to help immigrants using their executive power. But we're now in a situation where we have a president who's kind of more like Ben Franklin. He thinks immigrants are bad, so he's using his executive power to try to prevent immigrants from coming here and to try to mass deport them. And that's the situation that we're in right now that's been in the headlines. So I want to go back and review a little bit about the history here and the facts of immigration law. Of course, we're a nation of immigrants. We have a national myth that we welcome immigrants. It's kind of a myth because we haven't historically welcomed them that much. The Irish were considered a bad crowd of people in the 1800s when they were coming in mass, and we weren't very welcoming of them. We weren't very welcoming of the Chinese or the Japanese. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act that was part of our law for a really long time where we just wouldn't let anybody Chinese into the country. But we have a national myth that a lot of us still believe that America is the nation of immigrants. And of course, many of us had to memorize or read Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," thinking that America's a home for refugees. That really hasn't been that true much in recent decades. This is kind of more of a myth. And the reality has been that we've had millions of people who are in the United States who aren't supposed to be here according to the law. We call them different things. Sometimes people call them illegal or undocumented or unauthorized. We have a legal system that is very complicated and impossible for the average person to understand and results in backlogs and quotas for legal immigration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have heavy worksite enforcement, so employers are constantly being investigated for having not done the paperwork correctly on their employees. And again, the legal system is a mess. It takes years and years to train an immigration lawyer to understand the law because it is so complicated. It's akin to tax law in its complexity. And I have a quote there on the slide that's actually from the Department of Homeland Security official spokesperson, Catherine Kraschauer. She was quoted in the Washington Post years ago saying that immigration law is a mystery and a mastery of obfuscation. And that's not a compliment to the state of the law. Ideally, in America, we want laws that the average person can understand and comply with. And that is not the case with immigration law, and it hasn't been in a really long time. One of the first things I always have to tell clients when we start a conversation about immigration law is it doesn't make any sense. It's arbitrary, it's complicated, it's full of contradictions, and it's just not easy to comply with. And I often hear from people whose ancestors immigrated a long time ago that their ancestors came legally. But that's because long ago we didn't really have any laws that prevented people from immigrating, or we didn't have very many laws. And so, people say, well, my ancestors came legally. Well, that was because we didn't have the legal system that we have today. And many of your ancestors didn't come legally. You just think they did. Like the Irish gentleman that I described earlier, he ran across the border and got caught, and they were trying to deport him. And he described all the other Irish just rushing the border agent to try to get across. But once they were in, they were home free. Nobody was going to deport them. Today, though, we have a president who's decided that he's going to end this lawlessness once and for all, and he's doing it through a promise of mass deportation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so who have we got living in Alaska and in the United States right now? We have a lot of different kinds of people with different rights and responsibilities. And I have a little chart here that shows the main categories. So we have native-born citizens, naturalized citizens, people who are nationals. All citizens are nationals, but there are some people who are only nationals. They're not citizens. So myself, I was born in the continental United States, so in Boston. So I'm a U.S. citizen by birth, and I'm also a national of the United States. We'll talk a little later about the nationals, but we have people in Alaska who are nationals but not citizens of the United States. We also have people who are lawful permanent residents. These are the proverbial name for them is a green card holder. Everybody calls them green cards. And they have permission to live and work in the United States permanently and to become citizens if they qualify, but they can be deported. So having a green card is not a guarantee that you'll get to live in America forever. You can be deported. We also have a lot of authorized non-citizens without green cards, without LPR status, and we have a lot of unauthorized immigrants. And that category is pretty complicated because some people who are unauthorized immigrants or who think they are actually turn out to be citizens. That happens a lot in Alaska. I have people coming into my office on a regular basis who tell me that they're unauthorized immigrants, and then I do their paperwork analysis on them. I look at the law and I look at their ancestors, and I figure out that they're actually American citizens and they just didn't know it. So that complicates the picture. But let me give you some examples. So these two were native-born citizens. Of course, John McCain has passed away, but when he was running for president, his citizenship came into question because he was born in Panama. And although Panama is a foreign country, his parents at the time were both American citizens. And because of a law passed by Congress to benefit military members living in Panama, he actually derived American citizenship through his parents, despite being born in Panama. Weirdly, in John McCain's case, though, he wasn't actually a citizen at the time of his birth. He became one when he was a toddler by Congress passing a law that conferred citizenship on people born in Panama to parents who were military personnel. And of course, Barack Obama, people were always questioning his citizenship, but it's clear that he was born in Hawaii, which is part of the United States. And he was not born in Africa, contrary to the rumors on the internet. He was born in Hawaii. But interestingly, even if he had been born in Africa, he would have been a citizen at birth because his mother was an American citizen. So regardless of where Barack Obama had been born, he was going to be a native-born citizen. We have naturalized citizens. We have tons of them in Alaska. Lots of them are members of the military. And these are people who were not U.S. citizens at birth, but became citizens after they came to the United States. And many of them, again, serve in our military, but we have a lot of these in Alaska because there's a lot of immigration, has been a lot of immigration to Alaska for people who have green cards, and they typically apply for citizenship or they apply through military service. That's very common in Alaska. We have a big military contingent up here. Another famous Alaskan who's a naturalized citizen, we just finished the Iditarod here, so I figured I'd throw up a picture of Martin Boozer, who's a naturalized American citizen who won the Iditarod. Yay, go Martin. Well, not this year, but in the past. Okay, so back to the categories. I mentioned the nationals, so I want to show you a map of American Samoa. The United States acquired American Samoa many, many, many years ago, and we also at the time acquired a lot of other territories in the Pacific. But most of them we later either incorporated into the United States or we gave them away again, like the Philippines. At one point, the Philippines was part of the United States, but we decided to let them be an independent country after World War II. American Samoa, though, never became an independent country. It's still part of the United States, but it hasn't been incorporated into the United States fully. So it's what we call an unincorporated territory of the United States. And it's the only one left except for a small island called Swains Island. So American Samoa and Swains Island are the only two unincorporated territories of the United States left in the world. They belong to the United States government, but the people born there are not nationals of the United States, are not citizens of the United States. They're only nationals, and they don't have the rights of citizens. So they have limited constitutional rights compared to a U.S. citizen, but they carry a U.S. passport, and their passport says the bearer is a national but not a citizen of the United States. We have a lot of these folks in Alaska, and interestingly, some of them are nationals and some of them are citizens. And that's because nationals are allowed to apply to become citizens, so they can become naturalized citizens. And many nationals have U.S. citizen ancestors, kind of like John McCain. So people born in American Samoa, if they have a U.S. citizen parent, grandparent, they can also be citizens at birth, even though they were born in American Samoa. But it's because they derived citizenship from their ancestors, not because they were born in American Samoa. If you're born in American Samoa and you don't have citizen ancestors, you're a national but not a citizen of the United States. And when you move to Alaska, you can find yourself in trouble if the Alaska state election officials register you to vote because you're not a U.S. citizen, so you're not supposed to be voting. And that's been a headline in the news. Uh, as far as immigration law goes, though, however, American Samoans can't be deported because they actually belong to the United States. So they're U.S. nationals and they can't be deported. They can be denied citizenship, though, if they vote or register to vote. So that's kind of an interesting twist on immigration law. We have that problem a lot in Alaska. Okay, so back to the people living in the U.S. We got through the nationals. Now we're going to talk about the green card holders, the lawful permanent residents. They typically, oh, sorry, I'm going to talk about foreign born. So lawful permanent residents, authorized non-citizens without LPR status, and unauthorized immigrants. Okay, so these are all the foreign born people. And the total foreign born as a percentage of state population is shown on this slide. There's a list of the top states to the right there. You can see California, New Jersey, New York, Florida, no surprise. This is a map put out by the United States Census Bureau. It's obviously not to scale. They made Hawaii really big and Alaska really small. But this is to show you generally the big states as far as immigration goes. And Alaska is not in the top 10. We have about 7.9% foreign born in our population right now. And these are going to be the green card holders, the people with something less than a green card but who are here legally, and then the unauthorized immigrants. So that's about the percentage of our population. That's a pretty good solid chunk of people, about 58,000 people. Most of them, you'll be happy to hear, are perfectly legal. They don't have an unauthorized immigration status. They're usually green card holders or they have some sort of visa. We have a very tiny, tiny population of unauthorized immigrants in Alaska, and that's a function of geography and the fact that you can't just run across the border very easily from countries that have large numbers of people trying to come to the United States. Okay, so this is a typical specimen of a green card. That's what it looks like. It's actually green. And this is a specimen put out by USCIS to show people what they look like. And of course, this one's completely made up, but it shows the person's birth date and the country they were born in and their USCIS number and their name. And it says what category they came in, how they immigrated to America. If somebody has one of these, they can become a United States citizen eventually if they qualify, but they have to take a test of American history and government. They have to speak English. They have to live in America for a certain period of time. and they have to have had their green card for a required period of time. So it's not always easy to get citizenship once you get a green card. Okay, back to the other people. Authorized non-citizens without green cards. There's tons of them in Alaska, and there's more than 80 categories of these people, but they include treaty traders and investors, foreign students, professional workers, exchange visitors, intercompany transferees, vocational students, outstanding workers, religious workers, treaty NAFTA. I haven't listed all 80 of the categories, but there's more than 80 different categories of people. And you actually have a lot of them down in the Soldotna area. There's a fair number of treaty trader investors down there. These are people who own small businesses and they don't have green cards, but they're running a small business. It's a particularly popular visa for people that are doing things like tourism, the tourism industry. It's pretty popular. Canadians with small businesses, hotels, restaurants, ice cream shops. There's all kinds of people down on the peninsula that have that status. You don't have so many F students because most of them are in Anchorage or Fairbanks or Juneau, but sometimes they live down on the peninsula too. There are a fair number of professional workers, H's and J's. In the news recently, there's been a lot of coverage of the fact that the Alaska school system has a lot of teachers from foreign countries, and they tend to be in the H category or the J category, particularly the Filipino workers who are teachers in Alaska are H's and J's. And then intracompany transferees are pretty popular in Alaska. These are people who worked for some company overseas and they're transferring them to the United States. Years ago, this was an extremely popular visa with the oil companies. So British Petroleum would transfer somebody from the United Kingdom to Alaska, and they would get them an L visa. And they wouldn't get them a green card right away. They'd just get them a temporary work visa. And then down in Seward, they have vocational students. Those are people who are going to a vocational school. The O is pretty popular in Alaska. I know people who are doctors, lawyers, helicopter ski guides, Iditarod mushers, all kinds of people are on O visas. Religious workers are popular. And then, of course, treaty NAFTA is very, very popular. It's not called NAFTA anymore, but we still, in the immigration world, call it a TN, treaty NAFTA visa. And that's popular with Canadians and Mexicans. Again, this is just a kind of rough overview. It's not all the different categories, just a few of them. And then we also have a whole bunch of other people who are here temporarily but don't have a green card. Asylees and refugees, people with temporary protected status. Those are folks from a constantly changing list of countries, generally countries that have turbulence or conflict or maybe an earthquake or something going bad in their country. And the Secretary of Homeland Security can declare that the country is eligible for TPS. And then people from that country are allowed to live and work in the United States temporarily while the problem is going on. But sometimes the problem in their country lasts for years and years and years, and they have TPS for a really long time. Sometimes TPS can last for more than 20 years, so it's not always temporary, but there is a constantly evolving list of countries. And then we have immigration parolees. There's a lot of them in Alaska right now because of the Uniting for Ukraine program, U4U. Folks were given a parole, which has nothing to do with criminal parole. It's an immigration parole, and it dates back to medieval times when armies would be fighting, and an officer from one army would want to talk to an officer from another army, and they would get a parole to come over and talk to the other army without getting killed. So this term evolved to be used by the immigration authorities in the United States as a way to bring somebody into the country when they don't have a visa. They get something called parole. And the President of the United States can authorize anybody to be paroled into the United States for any reason. And presidents have done that. So presidents started doing it most explicitly. The Cubans were getting paroled starting way back under Reagan. Vietnamese refugees were being paroled. Military spouses were being paroled. Kurds from Iraq were being paroled in when they got evacuated after they were fighting Saddam Hussein long, long ago. Parole programs were set up to bring in religious refugees who couldn't get visas very quickly or couldn't get refugee status very quickly. Thousands and thousands of immigrants came in on parole over the last 50 years or so. And the latest crowd are the Uniting for Ukraine, where the president decided that people from Ukraine deserve to be allowed to come to the U.S. temporarily. So you'll hear the term parole, but again, it doesn't mean anything to do with any criminal activity at all. It just means they're being allowed in fast without having to spend years and years waiting for a visa. And then we also have something in Alaska we see a lot of called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. That was a program set up years ago under President Obama to allow young people who've lived in the US since they were children to get a work permit and work here temporarily, but they don't get a green card and they don't have a path to citizenship. They're just temporarily here. And again, this is executive action, not passed by Congress. So there's no statutory protection for them. And the president has tried to cancel their program, and a lot of them are finding themselves now getting arrested and detained and deported, even though they've lived here since they were kids, because there's no protection for them in any statute. It's just the grace of the president that lets them be here. So these are just some of the categories of people that are running around Alaska who are affected by the current situation with the president. Okay, most people in America who don't know about immigration law keep talking about something called the path to citizenship. And I've diagrammed it out here. It looks really easy, right? You start life as an alien, that's a foreigner, and maybe you get a non-immigrant visa, and then you get your green card, and then you get your citizenship. And people are always talking about this path and saying, why don't these immigrants get on the path to citizenship? Well, the answer is that it's really hard to do that. Even if you qualify, it's going to take you 5 to 15 years to negotiate this path to citizenship. And that's if you qualify. And most people don't qualify. So this is a more accurate diagram of how to get a green card than that one is. This was published by Reason magazine many years ago, in 2009, and they actually put together a flow chart to show how hard it was to get a green card. And this flow chart's a mess because that's an accurate visual representation of the immigration laws. You'll notice all those stop signs that say, sorry, sorry, you don't qualify. That's what Reagan was actually talking about back in the 1980s. He wanted the laws fixed because he said it was really too hard for people to get legal in America. And it was Congress's fault. They had made the laws so complicated that it was just really, really difficult to get a green card unless you were lucky and you were married to a middle-class American who wanted to sponsor you. That was kind of the one easy way left to get a green card. That was a popular way back when he was president. But for the average person outside the world, outside America, who wasn't married to a middle-class American, it was pretty hard to get a green card. And you just met with stop signs and you had to hire lawyers and pay a ton of money, and it was super complicated and super difficult. And that's why we had so many people who are here who weren't documented. This is an example of a quote from a real person who was trying to immigrate to America, a doctor born in India, and it took him about 8 years to get a green card, and he had to spend 2 years separated from his family in order to negotiate the process. He was a doctor, and he had a lawyer, and he was paying his lawyer a ton of money, but even so, the complicated immigration system was making it almost impossible for him to immigrate legally. He was trying to do everything right, and the system just said he had to wait forever and pay a lot of money to lawyers, and it was just going to take a really long time. So, starting, I would say, in the 90s, politicians started realizing that immigration was a hot election issue, and they could win elections if they bashed immigrants. So we started seeing people turning around in the elections cycle saying, if I bash immigrants, I can get elected. So let me go ahead and start bashing immigrants. And the political parties actually studied this and figured out that this was going to be a winning election strategy. So they didn't actually want to fix immigration law. They just wanted to get elected by bashing immigrants. And I have kind of a typical cartoon here saying, this is obviously supposed to be Donald Trump, and he's saying, our country is full. You can't come in. You're all animals. You're bad people. You're criminals. You're terrorists. And you can win an election now by saying this kind of thing. And so that's why he started doing it. I mean, it was explicitly part of the strategy that to win an election, that if you bashed immigrants, you could win. And you're supposed to blame the other guy and say it's his fault that the immigration laws are really screwed up, and accuse him of being too easygoing on the criminals, and tell the voters that you're just going to get really super tough on immigration, and that's going to win you an election. So that's become the winning strategy to win an election, is to make immigration a focus and say that you're gonna bash immigrants. So time of Trump, this is kind of a pretty quick summary of what's going on. He promised when he was running for election that he would engage in mass deportation. And he promised he was going to deport 1 million people the first year he was president this time around. Has he succeeded on that promise? No, because it's actually a lot harder to deport people than he thought it was going to be. but they're sure trying. Okay, now they did miss that quota for the first year of his office. They didn't manage to get 1 million people deported, but they're trying really, really, really hard to deport as many people as possible. And they're doing it any way they can because this was a promise that the president made that he was just going to deport as many people as possible. He also got Congress to pass the BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill, to give billions of dollars to the Department of Homeland Security to focus on deporting as many people as possible. And he's engaged in lawmaking by executive order. That hint that Ronald Reagan gave him a long time ago was you can change the immigration laws by executive order. You just have to issue a lot of orders, and it's going to take people a while to react to them. Even if the orders are illegal, it's going to take lawyers and a lot of money to fight them. And you'll get away with a lot of stuff if you issue a bunch of illegal orders because people will not be able to get the resources to fight them back very easily. So this has been an explicit strategy. It's kind of what we call flood the zone. If you issue a whole pile of illegal orders to the executive branch, they're going to follow your orders because they have to. You're the president and they work for you. And then you kind of wait for all the lawsuits to start. And then you fight the lawsuits with the Department of Justice. And a lot of times people won't be able to sue because they don't have the resources, they don't have the money. So you'll get away with a lot of stuff. And it's kind of like a drone attack, except it's a drone attack on the legal system by our own executive branch, where they're just pushing out these illegal orders that they know are illegal, but they expect they're going to get away with a lot of it. And the president of the United States right now has completely weaponized the immigration system, which was, set up by Congress a long time ago, but it was supposed to be fair. And it's now been weaponized to try to deport as many people as possible. And that's kind of the backdrop for what's going on in Alaska. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about the specifics of what's happening in Alaska, but I wanted you to just know that across the board, the executive branch has now weaponized the immigration system against immigrants. So they're not approving a lot of benefits for people as much as they used to. The agency is supposed to provide benefits to people, not just deport everybody. And sometimes somebody will be eligible for deportation, but they're also eligible to stay if they apply for a benefit. And right now, what we're seeing is they're not approving the benefit application if the person could be deported because they want to get the deportations way up. They want to show the president they're deporting as many people as possible. So even if somebody's eligible for something, they won't let them apply for it, or they'll deny the application in favor of deporting them. And the bureaucracy right now has no incentive to approve cases because they don't get credit from the White House if they approve something. They only get credit if they deport people. So they have weaponized the system completely at the moment against immigrants. Okay, and this is another cartoon that's kind of illustrating some of the crazy rhetoric that's going on. They're showing the president saying a horde of rapists, drug dealers, and terrorists is marching towards our border, and they're disguised as women and children. I mean, they're kind of saying all kinds of crazy things about the immigrants coming in. The reality is that immigrants have a much lower crime rate than American citizens. They commit crimes at a much lower rate. The vast majority of people coming here are not coming here to commit crimes or do bad things to Americans. They want to be with their families, they want to work, or they're escaping a bad situation like a war or some death threat or whatever. The vast majority are not actually trying to do anything bad. They're just trying to do what most of our ancestors did, which is try to find a safe place to raise a family and live in freedom. But the president has learned that he can win an election by demonizing immigrants, and so that's what he's been doing. And here's another cartoon that I think illustrates what's going on. It's the president says that children have lost their parents. We have all these kids running around America that don't have their parents, and so the cartoonist is saying, "We deported your parents, and now we can't find them. We didn't look for them, but we still can't find them." And that's been happening across the board. They've been breaking up families and deporting the parents without the kids, and deporting kids without their parents, and sometimes deporting the whole family together, including U.S. citizens who are in the family. It's kind of a crazy time. I've just never seen any of this before in my lifetime as an immigration lawyer. This is a chart that just came out yesterday, I believe, or day before, from National Public Radio, analyzing the Board of Immigration Appeals. So the Board of Immigration Appeals is an administrative agency that's supposed to fairly judge immigrants' cases. If the government's trying to deport them, the immigrants have the right to appeal the decision to deport them to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And so NPR ran a statistical study to look at what was happening at the Board of Immigration Appeals, and it's basically been weaponized against immigrants. And you can see this by the numbers there. If you look at 2026, the immigrants are only winning 5% of their cases. And last year, they were only winning 3% of their cases. That just shows you that it's not a fair system anymore. In the past, the immigrants had a pretty fair shot. You can see by the numbers there. If they appealed their case to the Board of Immigration Appeals, they had a decent chance of winning a case. And the board has been completely politicized, and they've basically been appointed by Trump and told to deport as many people as possible. So they're coming out with rather alarming decisions that don't actually follow the law. If you're a lawyer and you read them, you just go, I can't believe a lawyer wrote this decision. But the answer to the clients always is you're going to lose at the Board of Immigration Appeals because Trump's told them to order you deported. So nobody can win anymore at the Board of Immigration Appeals. And when they lose at the Board of Immigration Appeals, their only shot is to go into federal court after that. They have to go into the Circuit Court of Appeals, which is very expensive, difficult, and hard for people to do. But again, the system's been weaponized. This is from Politico. Politico is a publication that follows Capitol Hill, and it's an online publication, but considered reputable. And they did a report a couple days ago, actually yesterday. Federal judges have ruled more than 7,000 times in recent months that ICE has illegally locked people up. Okay, so this is an analysis that they did of all the habeas corpus cases that immigrants were filing. And it's correct, in my opinion, what's going on. There's just lawlessness going on at Department of Homeland Security right now because they're trying to meet the president's order to just deport as many people as possible. So they're just grabbing people and trying to deport them. And their theory is that most people won't be able to hire a lawyer and won't be able to stop what's happening to them fast enough. So this is their explicit strategy. Again, it's flood the zone, break the law, we won't get caught. And if we do get caught, the president will probably give us an amnesty or, we won't have to pay any damages. So we'll get away with it. Okay, so what's happening in Alaska? That's what you all want to know, right? All right, so in Alaska, we have Department of Homeland Security targeting immigrants explicitly because the president's told them to do that. He wants them to engage in mass deportation. And they're particularly going after asylum seekers and trying to deport them. So they're looking explicitly at people that they can claim are here illegally or didn't enter legally, or even if they entered legally, their status has expired because they applied for asylum. They're looking through all the immigration benefits applications filed by people in Alaska looking for people to deport. So if you file for something right now, it can be dangerous because it can lead to your deportation. If you file for citizenship, it can be dangerous because it can lead to your deportation. If you file for a green card, it can be dangerous because it can lead to your deportation. If you're on a student visa and you don't file something by the right time, or maybe you got a speeding ticket or something, it can lead to your deportation. They're kind of going through all the records they can to try to find people to deport. And we're seeing a lot of bad behavior by federal agents. People ask me, why is that happening? Well, it's happening for a couple of reasons. One big reason is because they stopped training them properly, and they have no oversight by lawyers. So I was told recently by a lawyer who works for Department of Homeland Security that they no longer have any legal review when they draft documents to try to deport somebody. The lawyers aren't required to look at them. So typically, if you're charged with a crime in Alaska in the state system, the police are going to start things with a police report, but then there's going to be a prosecutor who's going to look over everything before they bring charges against you. That's not happening anymore in the immigration system. They're just bringing charges against people with no legal review. And they're making a lot of unlawful arrests that violate the Constitution. The Constitution says they need a judicial warrant to go into somebody's house and arrest them. And they can't get a judicial warrant, so they've decided to change the Constitution when it comes to immigration. And they've told the officers that they don't need a judicial warrant anymore. They can just write up their own warrant, which is called an administrative warrant. Or they can make a warrantless arrest without any warrant at all. And so we're seeing in Alaska a lot of unlawful arrests of immigrants. They're totally unlawful, but the immigrant doesn't know they're unlawful, and there's no way you can't physically resist. So they make these unlawful arrests, they put people in detention, and then they doctor the paperwork up afterward to try to justify the fact that they grabbed somebody. I've seen false arrest warrants that they arrested somebody and the arrest warrant had the wrong name on it. I've seen false declarations under oath put into federal court by immigration officers that just have false information on them about the immigrant. And there's just massive violations of due process going on right now. Due process is notice and the opportunity to be heard before you get deported. And they're just not doing due process by the book anymore because they can get away with it. And there's no way to stop them from doing that at the moment because the president's basically saying it's okay to do that. So we have lots of law breaking going on by the Department of Homeland Security in order to meet the quota. Okay, and I want to give you an example of a case in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up on the procedure here. So if some immigrant or even a citizen who's mistakenly thought to be an immigrant gets arrested in Alaska, they're put in custody by the immigration agents in Alaska, and then they're typically transferred to the lower 48 states. And this is because Alaska does not have an immigration detention facility. Immigration detention is civil detention. And so most of the immigration detention facilities are not officially jails or anything. They're civil detention facilities, and they're mostly run by contractors. And the contracting companies are making millions and millions of dollars right now because they're getting paid by the federal government to detain people civilly in their facilities, and they make a profit doing it. So the companies, private prison companies, are highly incentivized to have this happening to detain people because they make a lot of money off it. And they're all in the lower 48. We don't have any civil detention centers in Alaska. So when they get arrested in Alaska, they're usually initially held at the Anchorage Correctional Center, but sometimes they're just shipped out of state immediately. And they're usually put in a detention center, most often in Tacoma, Washington, but it could be anywhere else. But it could be in Texas or Louisiana or California. They're transferred to the lower 48, and then they're given a so-called hearing in immigration court. And I put court in quotes there because these are not really courts anymore. And they never really were, actually. They're the judges are employees of the executive branch of the government. They work for the Department of Justice, and they're usually attorneys, but they work for the Department of Justice, and they have the title immigration judge. Although recently, Department of Justice changed it on their website for recruiting people to call them deportation judges. So they're not really judges like we think of as United States District Court judges or state court judges who are, required to meet certain qualifications and go through a careful vetting process. They're actually employees of the who work for the president. Okay, and it's called a court, but it's not really operating like a court anymore. The immigration judges are routinely denying people bond. They just tell them they're going to stay in detention indefinitely if they fight their detention. So if they fight their case, they're just going to be stuck in a private prison where the food is bad and there may be bugs and bad health care and, terrible conditions. Sometimes people are sleeping on the floor right now. So if they fight their case, they're going to be in a bad situation. The courts deny them due process all the time. They don't have a right to an attorney unless they can find one and pay for one. The government doesn't provide them with a free attorney, and it's really hard to get an attorney when you're in immigration detention. And then they're fast-tracking denials of asylum cases. So basically, they're trying to grab people, put them in a detention center, deny them access to counsel. When they can't get a lawyer, they go in front of the judge without a lawyer. The government, of course, has a lawyer. The government's lawyer's job is to get them deported, and they just get fast-tracked to being denied. And then if they want to appeal, they're going to be appealing to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is going to deny their case. We know that because of the statistics. So people are then being forced to file something called a habeas corpus petition, and that's Latin for bring the body forward to the court. And habeas corpus petitions are filed in United States district courts. And of course, that's Anchorage right now, the United States District Court for the District of Alaska, which only has at the moment two permanent judges, one of whom just started. Up until recently, we only had one full-time judge, permanent judge. The others were only retired. So in Alaska, it's really tough. But you can file a habeas corpus petition with the federal court, and then you can try to get out. And so now I'm going to give you an example of a real case Okay, this is a real case. I'm not revealing the name of the person, but they're probably going to be in the news here shortly. So soon enough, you'll hear their name. But this person was a Venezuelan immigrant who came to Alaska legally when Biden was president. Biden had an executive program called the Venezuelan Parole Program, where he was allowing Venezuelans to come to Alaska legally on immigration parole, kind of like the Ukrainians. And he was doing that because there was a lot of terrible things going on in Venezuela where the government was treating people really badly and, shooting demonstrators and imprisoning people. And there are a lot of political prisoners and things like that going on. So Biden agreed to let a certain number of Venezuelans come to Alaska legally. And he gave this particular Venezuelan something called a parole. The guy cleared a background check. He wasn't a criminal or a terrorist, and he was allowed to come into Alaska and gotten permission to work. And once he was in Alaska, he met and married a United States citizen who happened to be a federal contractor. So they got married and filed for a green card because he was now married to a US citizen who was allowed to sponsor him, and he got a work permit. And again, this person had no criminal record and was legally allowed to enter the United States. So he was not an undocumented immigrant who came across the border by jumping a fence or coming in illegally or hiring a smuggler. He had come in perfectly legally. Well, given that Trump was now the president, he decided he didn't like the fact that Biden had, quote, let millions of unauthorized immigrants into the country. So they decided to go after all the Venezuelans who had been allowed to come in legally. And this person had been scheduled for an interview to get his green card at the USCIS office in Anchorage. That's United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And they're supposed to process benefits applications. This was an easy case for a lawyer. He should have been approved. He wasn't a criminal. He's married to an American citizen. The American citizen had filed all the paperwork. He was supposed to go to an interview. But USCIS is under the gun now to deport as many people as possible. And so they called ICE and said, hey, we got a Venezuelan here who applied for a green card. You can come and grab him. And they arranged with ICE to have the guy arrested a few days before his interview. So instead of letting him go to his interview and get his green card, they decided to grab him and have him arrested. And then he wouldn't be able to go to his interview, so then they canceled his interview. Okay, so they come and grab him in December and they filed false documents. They had a false arrest warrant and a false notice to appear in immigration court. And the false arrest warrant had the wrong name on it. The notice to appear said that he'd entered the United States illegally. That was not true. So they just swore under oath on documents that he had entered the U.S. illegally. And they detained him in Anchorage first, and then they shipped him to Tacoma, Washington. And then when his lawyer reported that they had falsified the documents in his case, they immediately shipped him to Texas because they figured Texas was a better place to ship somebody when there was an investigation going on because Texas is governed by the Fifth Circuit, which is a court of appeals that is known to be really tough on immigrants. Lawyers jokingly call it the Taliban circuit, but they were going to ship him out of the Ninth Circuit where then he might get some relief and send him to Texas. Luckily, even the Texas judges thought this was outrageous and crazy. So he was released in March 2026 by a Texas judge on a habeas corpus petition. And this is an example. This is actually the docket entry by the judge. The judge said the person's first name is Jose. So he said he was granting his petition for a writ of habeas corpus, and DHS must release him from custody under conditions no more restricted than those in place before they grabbed him. And they have to release him in a public place on or before Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, and notify his lawyer of the exact location and time of his release at least 2 hours before they release him. And then they have to comply by filing a status report with the court saying that he has been released. Okay, and you're probably wondering, why does the judge have to put all this detail in here? Well, because they were releasing people in places where they couldn't be found, and they'd be released without any money, without any change of clothes or possessions or cell phone or anything, and they'd just be dumped out of some detention center. And they would be in a really bad situation when that happened. I mean, this is a guy who lives in Alaska, and they're just going to dump him outside a detention center without telling anybody that they're doing that. So the judge, the federal judge, has to tell the DHS agents to notify his lawyer that he's going to be released exactly what time so the lawyer can go get him. And then the judge doesn't trust them to comply with the order, so he wants them to file a status report confirming that he's been released with the court. They have to do that now. The fact that judges are even issuing these orders tells you that there's something seriously wrong with the system because they can't trust the government to comply with the court order to release him. So they're giving specific instructions about where and when they have to be released, and that they can't, put him on an ankle monitor and otherwise harass him or tell him that they can't leave the city of Dallas or something like that, which is what they were doing previously. So Judge Garcia down in Texas issued a final judgment in the case and ordered him released. And the good news is this particular person made it back to Alaska. His U.S. citizen spouse had to fly down to Texas, pick him up, get him a plane ticket, bring him back to Alaska because he had nothing with him at all because of being detained by immigration. He didn't have his cell phone. He didn't have, uh, he only had the clothes that they arrested him in. That was it. So his spouse had to fly all the way down to Texas to pick him up because immigration isn't going to pay to fly him back to the place where they arrested him. This is a real case, and it's just an example of one. There's a lot of these kind of cases going on right now in Alaska. They're happening, all the time, every week, and it's because the president has ordered them to just mass deport people, so they're trying to do it. And again, this is a guy who's eligible for a green card. Now that he's been released, he's going to be able to reschedule his green card application and apply for his green card, but he'll probably have to do it in front of the immigration court instead of applying like he normally would have previously. Um, okay, this is an exclusive from 2 days ago by a news reporting TPM. They just covering a court case out there, and this is one particular court case that they were covering that was kind of a class action or group lawsuit. And the judge had just ordered that the Trump administration had wrongfully deported more than 100 asylum seekers. The numbers are actually a lot higher than that. This 100 quote is just from this one case that where people sued. There were 100 people involved in the case that more than 100 of them got deported illegally. And they were not supposed to be deported because there was a court order saying they couldn't be deported, but the Trump administration deported them anyway. Okay, so what can you do? All right, well, you recognize all of those people. That's your Alaska congressional delegation. If you care about these issues, I would encourage you to call Lisa, Dan, and Nick. However, I will tell you that Dan and Nick will not do anything to help you. Lisa will try and listen to you. However, at the moment, it's obvious to anybody that watches Capitol Hill that the Alaska congressional delegation is mostly doing what Trump wants, and Trump wants people deported. And so Nick and Dan in particular are not willing to stick their necks out and try to help an immigrant. They will give lip service. They will take your complaint and write it down and tell you that they'll get back to you. And then you'll probably get some random form letter a couple months later that says they're not willing to help you because they support the big, beautiful bill and they support border security and mass deportations. However, I would encourage you to try. It is true that Congress is dysfunctional, but this is an election year, and it may be that calls to our legislators may sway some of them to maybe get some backbone or a spine, because they have to realize that you might not vote for them if you don't think they have a backbone or a spine. So even though they're not going to probably do anything to help, I recommend that people call them and try to voice your opinions in any event and let them know what you think. And you can do this by phone call. You can do it by going on their website and filling in the contact form on their website, but let them know what you think. The bad news, of course, is that Congress has essentially ceded its constitutional authority to the executive branch at this point. I just read an opinion piece in the Washington Post today that basically said Congress is broken. They're no longer a co-equal branch of government with the president. So it's likely that given that state of affairs, they can't effectively do anything anyway, but you should still exercise your right under the First Amendment to call them and give them your opinion about these things. I've been a lawyer in Alaska for a very long time, and I'm just shocked and appalled at the behavior of my fellow lawyers when it comes to enforcing the law. They're not doing that anymore. They're letting the government just run roughshod over people and break the law. And Dan Sullivan's a lawyer, Lisa Murkowski's a lawyer. They should know better. They should know better than to let federal agents just break the law right and left in favor of a political agenda. Even if it is going to get their boss elected at some point or get his candidates elected, nobody should be breaking the law. It should be against the law to do that. Okay, a little bit more about Alaska. Trump is also trying to attack citizens who were born in America. He issued an executive order that on its face is completely illegal, purporting to change the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed after the Civil War, and it was supposed to make sure that the Supreme Court of the United States could no longer take citizenship away from people. Some of you may have heard of the Dred Scott decision, which was a terrible decision of the United States Supreme Court that basically said African Americans couldn't be citizens of the United States. The 14th Amendment was passed to repudiate Dred Scott and also to fix for all time in writing what had been thought to be the law. And up until the 14th Amendment was passed, everybody in America thought that you were a citizen of the US if you were born here because that had been the British law. And we adopted that British law from Great Britain. We had the same law when we declared our independence that the British had, which was anybody born in the British realm was a citizen of Britain. So we had thought that was the law, but then it was under attack by the Supreme Court prior to the Civil War. And we fought the Civil War. And after the Civil War, Congress said, well, we're going to pass a 14th Amendment to the Constitution to make it clear that anybody born in the United States is going to be a citizen of the United States. And that's going to be it. And we're going to put it in writing, and then there won't be any question about it. Well, for over 100 years, there wasn't any question about it till Donald Trump came along and issued an executive order. And he decided to change the law on his own with an executive order. And he basically created a new rule that doesn't make any sense. That he said people born after a certain date are not going to be citizens of the United States, even if they were born here, unless their parents have certain kinds of immigration statuses. And it's not really clear, what statuses are going to qualify. But basically, he's making his own 14th Amendment subject to executive authority. And of course, he did that immediately. Lawsuits got filed. The state of Washington filed a lawsuit against him, among other states, and said this was unconstitutional. The case is going up to the Supreme Court, and we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. But if they rule in favor of President Trump, then millions of Americans are no longer going to be American citizens. They're going to be subject to being deported, even though they were born in the United States. I don't know where they're going to deport them if they were born in the United States, because many of them won't be citizens of any other country. But Trump is going to single-handedly create a whole class of people who are undocumented living in America, have no rights as citizens, and aren't citizens of any other country. So it's going to be a giant mess for everybody. A little bit of good news, though, is that Alaska may be somewhat protected from this, and that's because we have our own statute. In 1952, when we were not yet a state, Congress passed a law, and I have it up there on the screen, that says anybody born in Alaska on or after March 30th, 1867, except for Native Americans, is a citizen of the United States at birth. And of course, that's the famous date when Alaska became part of the United States as a territory. So at the time Congress passed this law, Alaska was not yet a state. And Congress was also concerned about Native Americans because they had not become citizens of the United States until 1924. So that explains the strange language in there about non-citizen Indians. Not politically correct term, but this is what the statute says. And it basically says anybody born in Alaska is going to be a citizen of the United States at birth, and it doesn't matter who their parents are. So in Trump's executive order, he made a big deal out of you can't be a citizen if your parents are this or your parents are that or your parents are on a student visa or your parents are tourists. That executive order presumably would not apply to anybody born in Alaska because we have our own statute, and Congress has not repealed the statute. President Trump did not seem to be aware that Alaska had its own statute when he passed his executive order, and Hawaii also has their own statute. In the lower 48, they don't have a statute like this. They have a different one that gives the president more authority to interpret it. But ours is really, really clear and hasn't been repealed. So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Donald Trump, we're going to have a really interesting situation in Alaska where we're likely to have a lot of pregnant women flying to our state to have babies because that way they'll be citizens of the United States, whereas they won't be if they're in Texas. And I keep your eyes peeled for that one. It's going to get kind of interesting. Okay, but that's a unique Alaska situation that I thought people would be interested in. Okay, I've come to the point where I think I've talked enough, and I'd be happy to take questions. I don't know, Amy, how you want to do that because obviously I can't hear anything that's going on in the room. I do know that we have people on the chat who can ask questions in the chat. So if anybody wants to put a question in the chat, I can try to answer it. And I don't know, Amy, if you want to take questions there and I can't hear them, you can maybe type them in the chat if that would work. But I'm open to answering people's
I think I
questions.
can bring my phone around and do that and also gather some questions. So I'll try to get some questions to you.
Okay, I hope some people have some questions. Yeah.
Okay. Um, First question. Are Ukrainian refugees already here at risk of being deported? And are all South African arrivals white?
Okay, two good questions. So let me try to break them down one at a time. So yes, the Ukrainians are in danger of being deported, and that's because most of them came in on the parole program. And President Trump has said he doesn't like parole programs that Biden created and he wants to end them. Fortunately, at the moment, he hasn't ended the Ukrainian parole program. I mean, you can't get in any, there aren't no new arrivals, but they're still renewing the parole of the Ukrainians who are already here. Unfortunately, parole is not a permanent status. It's just temporary and it's at the whim of the president, and it doesn't let you get a green card and it doesn't let you get citizenship. So they're in a very precarious situation. Um, the Ukrainians are better off, though, than people from other countries like Venezuela, who had the Venezuelan guy I mentioned to you had a parole that was just like the Ukrainian parole, but he came from a country that President Trump doesn't like. So he ended the parole program for Venezuela, but he didn't end renewals of paroles for the Ukrainians. So Ukrainians are better off than some of the people in the other countries that Trump has targeted, but they're still in a very precarious situation and they could face deportation. At the moment, though, any Ukrainians who already got into Alaska on parole can renew their parole and they can usually get a work permit. Unfortunately, again, it's temporary. The Alaska congressional delegation and the governor have been trying to lobby the administration to try to do something to give the Ukrainians some kind of better status, but so far they haven't actually done anything concrete. You know, it's more talk in the news media that they're going to try to do something, but they haven't actually done anything. So the Ukrainians are in a very precarious situation, and some of them are eligible to apply for green cards. Maybe they have a U.S. citizen spouse, or they have a U.S. citizen child, or maybe they have U.S. citizen ancestors. Some of them file for asylum, although then they're getting targeted for deportation if they do that sometimes. Some of them are eligible for work visas and are trying to work hard on securing those. A lot of them, unfortunately, I'm finding are deciding that our neighbor to the north or to the east is a better option. The Canadians have been very welcoming to Ukrainians and are happy to take educated, hardworking, non-criminal Ukrainians very quickly and absorb them into Canada. So I've seen a whole bunch of Ukrainians just deciding they're going to move to Canada. The Canadians, by the way, are definitely benefiting from this crazy dysfunction that is happening in the United States with the immigrants. The Canadians have explicitly decided that they like uh, hardworking immigrants, especially ones with college degrees and who speak English or French. And so they're willing to fast track a lot of people to Canadian green cards. And it's kind of sad for me as an American to see that we're losing the benefit of a lot of these folks. But I totally applaud the Canadians for, deciding they're going to see an opportunity there and take it, because it's benefiting Canada. I mean, they're getting a lot of great workers who America doesn't want. And then sometimes they're benefiting because the workers are creating businesses in Canada and, getting Canadian citizenship, and then they're coming back to the US as Canadians. So it's kind of a convoluted path, but some people are able to do that. And a side note on the Canadians, by the way, the Canadians just decided to go after American citizens and make them Canadians. They recently had a change in law in Canada that allows any American with a Canadian ancestor to get Canadian citizenship. And they're finding that tons of American citizens are suddenly interested in moving to Canada or at least getting a Canadian passport. So there's a huge backlog of applications for Canadian citizenship from Americans right now. And there's a bunch of people in Alaska who've been applying for this. But that's been a recent change in the law. And I didn't mention it earlier, but part of the fallout from this anti-immigration policy is that a lot of Americans are actually trying to go to other countries now. So there's been a big, huge uptick in American citizens seeking dual citizenship in Canada, Spain, the UK, Ireland, Italy, you name your country, and American citizens right now are thinking about expatriating themselves and going to another country. There's been a huge uptick in that. And the State Department also recently announced a reduction in the fee if you want to renounce your American citizenship. You only have to pay a little over $400 now, whereas previously you had to pay a couple $1,000s, and now it's cheaper to get rid of your American citizenship than it used to be. So we're seeing a big uptick in that too, where people are not just getting citizenship in another country, but they're renouncing their American citizenship. Okay, the second question, totally unrelated. Can you repeat that second part? You wanted me to deal with the Ukrainians
Yep,
first.
it was, are all South African arrivals white?
Okay, so that's a good question, and I'm going to have to explain a little about what refugees are. So, no, not all South African arrivals are white. However, all the South African refugee arrivals are white. Okay, and so let me try to expand on that a little bit. So, the U.S. has long had a refugee program. And refugee is a technical term, but it means somebody who is in a foreign country and they're trying to come to the United States as a refugee because they're going to face persecution in their home country. And they're facing persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. The President of the United States runs the refugee program for our country. And he decides, along with the folks who run the refugee program who work for him, how many refugees get to come into America every year. So every year, the president will announce we're going to take a certain number of refugees. And he can decide he's not going to take any refugees at all, or he's only going to take 2,000 refugees, or he's going to take 50,000 refugees. But the president makes that decision and he announces it every year. And then he also decides where he's going to take the refugees from. So in the past, the US government generally took refugees from war-torn countries. So if there was a war going on in the country and there was a large displaced population that was living outside that country, like in the Balkans years ago, there was a big war going on, and so they decided to take refugees who had run away from Serbia or Kosovo, and they would resettle them in the United States to avoid them getting killed by the folks that were fighting the war. So traditionally, refugees came from countries where there was a war going on and a lot of people had been displaced. Up until recently, there wasn't any war going on in South Africa, according to the State Department, and there weren't South Africans who'd been displaced who were living in refugee camps in other countries. But there were people in Somalia, Sudan, Syria, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all these places where we've been having a lot of wars going on. And so the refugees were mostly coming from countries where there had been a big war. President Trump announced that he believed that white Afrikaners, people who are white of the white race and who are of Afrikaner descent, were being persecuted in South Africa, even though there's no war or anything, and they weren't like living outside South Africa. And he specially designated them for the refugee program. And then he cut off the refugee programs from other countries. So basically, at the moment, the only refugees coming into the United States, I mean, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, are white Afrikaners who have declared to the US government that they're being persecuted in South Africa by their black neighbors on account of their race. And they've been specially designated for fast track refugee status. They take priority over all other refugees, and they get to come to the United States ahead of people who are living in refugee camps in Sudan and Somalia and Pakistan and other places. And so far, as from what I can understand from the statistics that have been published, there's only a handful who've come to Alaska, but they all are white South Africans because you can't be designated for the refugee program from South Africa if you're not a white South African. As far as other South Africans go, there's still other South Africans coming to Alaska in different other visa categories. Maybe they're married to an American citizen, or they're on a work visa. I've had plenty of people coming from South Africa who are in those categories. So they can be of any race. The people marrying American citizens could be a black South African or an Indian South African or some kind of Asian South African. But the ones who are designated for the refugee program have to be white Afrikaners or of white descent of some sort. I hope that answers that question. Let me know if I wasn't clear on that, and I'd be happy to try to clarify that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was pretty good. So there's another No Kings protest next weekend. What should our signs say about immigration?
Well, you might want to take the quote from the Declaration of Independence and remind people about that because um, that was our grievance against King George. And it's ironic to me, knowing what I know about immigration history, that we're back to that. I can go back to that on the slide if anybody wants to see that again. I'll go. I don't know if can you still see that, Amy? Can you guys still see that?
Yep, we got it.
Okay, so this is from the Declaration of Independence. Um, the king had obstructed the population of the states, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners and refusing to pass others to encourage them to migrate. One thing I didn't touch on, but this is something everybody should have in the back of their minds, is this is specifically hurting Alaska in terms of population loss. Our state is losing population at the moment, and one of the reasons the whole entire country is going to start losing population is because of immigration policy. It's not something that people talk about explicitly at the moment, although you can find the numbers if you go look at the population statistics people. But the native born population right now in America is not replacing itself. It's been the immigrants who are having babies who have kept our population stable. And so this new immigration policy by the president, this very anti-immigration policy, is actually going to lead to an acceleration of loss of population nationwide and in Alaska. And people have run the numbers on it, and we're basically going to have a much lower population if Trump keeps up the next 3 years. Our population is going to go downhill, and we're going to rapidly age. So we're going to have a lot more old people in the population and not so many workers. And this is going to provide a crisis in the labor market eventually. We already have one happening, which is pretty obvious if you do a lot of labor analysis. But we're going to be, because of this anti-immigrant policy, we're going to see a lot fewer legal immigrants. He's also against legal immigration. He's been trying to cut legal immigration, and we're going to have a decline in our population. So we're back 250 years later, where we've got a president who doesn't want the states to be populated. He's going to be reducing their population, and he has been refusing to pass immigration laws that will benefit our country and allow us to attract the best and the brightest to our shores. Unfortunately, our competitors are benefiting from this. So anyway, that's my comment on that. No kings.
Thank you. Is there anything state government can do against lawless deportation of Alaskans?
Good question. Not a whole lot because it's the federal government doing it, and the state can't really interfere with federal law enforcement. I think what the state could do, though, is talk at a state level. Governor Dunleavy could say, "We don't like this. We don't think you should be doing this. It's hurting us. Stop deporting the family members of Alaskans. We need these folks in our labor force. We don't want you to be deporting people." And of course, our governor could be encouraging the Alaska congressional delegation to call a halt to this. They funded it. They decided in the big beautiful bill to spend billions of dollars funding this kind of stuff. And they told DHS they have to spend the money, so DHS is trying to spend the money. It's behaving exactly the way a whole bunch of people predicted they would behave. I didn't mention it in my talk, but one of the reasons that they're hiring a lot of unqualified agents is they're under the gun to hire as many agents as they can. And so they're hiring people that aren't qualified for the job. They're people who fail background checks, people who can't pass the training. They've abbreviated the training to try to get these so-called law enforcement officers on the street as fast as they can, and they're not training them how to use firearms correctly or how to make a proper arrest or how to write a correct, arrest warrant or anything. So it's a big recipe for disaster when Congress just funds billions of dollars into an agency that's not prepared to absorb the money and just wants to spend it as fast as they can on whatever they can spend it on, be it private prisons or airplanes to move people or mass warehouses. It's crazy that they decided to spend all this money in this way. It's actually hurting our country overall, in terms of hurting our labor force and our population. If you go down to Texas right now, you see everybody in Texas is complaining they can't build anything because they can't get any construction workers because they're all being deported. It makes no sense to spend billions of dollars deporting construction workers when you need buildings built. What doesn't make any sense. So I would encourage everybody listening to try to go educate yourself on all these issues. I'm not the only one speaking out, and there's plenty of articles out there in reputable news media that talk about this problem. Everything I've told you, you can back up with reputable news articles. It's just crazy what we're doing, and it's not helping our national security. But the impact on our population, I think, has not been studied fully. So you're saying what else can the state do? Um, the state has created a new office that's supposed to be helping immigrants. It's an Office of Citizenship in Anchorage. Unfortunately, they don't have any way to push back against the federal government. There's not, the state's just not able to do that. But one thing that the state could do is maybe stop providing support to some of these efforts that are lawless. And there is liability for the state in doing that. To give you an example, if the government of the United States arrests somebody illegally and puts them in a Department of Corrections facility and they're being held illegally there, DOC can get sued for that. And they could end up paying damages if they participate in any kind of activities that are violating people's constitutional rights. I don't think anybody's paying any attention to that, but down the road, our country is going to be paying a big financial price for all this lawlessness because people are going to be suing for damages, and in many cases, they're going to get damages. Years ago, I was often successful when the old INS would arrest a U.S. citizen illegally, and they'd hold them for a couple days. I would file a lawsuit under the Federal Tort Claims Act, and I would get damages for the person for being held illegally when they were a U.S. citizen and they weren't supposed to be held. And the state can end up being liable, for damages if they participate in this lawless kind of behavior. So I would hope you'd bring your thoughts to the attention of your state legislators and make them realize that they could be paying for some of this stuff down the road if they participate in it.
Thank you. Trump is having huge prison centers, concentration camps built that hold thousands. Can it be possible that this is just for immigrants?
Well, I don't know, but one of the things years ago, I was on the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration, and this was many years ago, way before Trump, but we've created a monster in the private prison industry in America. We're a country that's decided that we're going to outsource detentions and prisons to private companies. And when I was serving on the commission at one point, there was a situation that had come out with a lawsuit where they had revealed the internal commentary at one of the private prison companies among their top executives. And it was something to the effect of this. I'm going to be paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact quote, but basically, it's a private prison company and they're trying to make profits. And they had gone out and looked at the demographics of private prisons and they said, we got a problem because the native born American population isn't committing crimes as much as they used to. The crime rate's dropping. And that's going to dry up our market. If the crime rate's dropping, there's not going to be so many people that we can lock up anymore. So we need to find a growth market. And they decided that immigrants were a growth market, that they could lobby the federal government to lock up more and more immigrants, and that would be growth for the private prison companies. And that's come to pass. That's exactly what's going on. The problem with all these big facilities that they're trying to create is eventually they're going to deport everybody or scare everybody. I mean, there's going to be a limit to the number of people they can round up. A lot of people are leaving the country now on their own. They're just terrified of what's happening in our country and they're just leaving. So I don't know what they're going to do with these facilities. They're just going to sit there empty. I would hate to think they're going to come up with some other group of people that they can just lock up for stuff. But it wouldn't surprise me given that in the past they were doing these kind of internal analyses and trying to identify people that could be locked up. So maybe if they run out of immigrants, they'll turn to people that don't file their tax returns on time, or they'll have mandatory jail sentences for other kinds of things so that they can make more money locking people up. But it's shocking and appalling to me as an American citizen, the number of people in the United States, we're supposed to be the land of freedom, who are sitting in some kind of jail, detention facility, prison. I mean, we used to think that was only something that totalitarian countries did, that it wasn't a good idea for the government to be just locking up people for the sake of locking them up. But it's become this billion-dollar industry now, and people are just making a lot of money locking other people up. And so there's the systems incentivized to do that. And of course, the private prison companies are also lobbying politicians and giving them campaign contributions and trying to incentivize them to allow this to continue. There was a brief moment of hope a couple of years ago where the executive branch had kind of come to the conclusion that this whole private prison thing was kind of corrupt when it came to immigrants, and they were trying to put them out of business, but that's all back now. They're back in business and making a ton of money. And it's gotten so bad that I was told recently that they didn't want a particular immigrant on an ankle monitor because the private prison company doesn't make as much money on an ankle monitor as they do if they keep them in a detention center. They get paid by the head per day for keeping people locked up. So the private prison companies really want to lock people up because they make just a, much more of a profit from doing that. I would encourage you to go research this stuff because it's really scary. And there really is no reason to be locking up most of these immigrants. Immigration detention is supposed to be civil detention. It's not criminal. People haven't committed a crime. They're just in the country without authorization, which is not a crime. It's not a crime to apply for asylum. So there isn't really any reason to lock them up other than the fact that it puts pressure on them to, they don't want to be in detention. They want to get out. So they're more likely to give up their case if they're put in detention. But the case example that I gave you is a good one. That guy had not committed any crimes. He was trying to apply for a green card, and he ended up benefiting a private prison company for many months because they just decided to lock him up, because Trump wants mass deportations. He hasn't been deported. He's not going to get deported. He's eligible for a green card. But the government spent, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars locking that guy up for several months. And it benefited a private prison company or several of them because they made a lot of money off having the guy in a detention center, multiple detention centers. And of course, state of Alaska is making money from Department of Corrections, gets paid. Last I checked, it was over $200 a day for each immigrant they lock up in a DOC facility. So they're making money as well. But the whole system is built on this idea that people are going to make a lot of money locking other people up, even though the people haven't committed any crime. And they're not criminals, they're just people that ran afoul of our immigration laws somehow. It's a crazy system. It doesn't make any sense. It's un-American.
Thank you. What happens if a detainee is given the choice to sign a form to self-deport, but they must also agree to never attempt to re-enter the US?
Right. Well, that's pretty common. The self-deport thing is pretty messed up because sometimes people sign agreeing to self-deport and they don't let them self-deport. They detain them anyway and put them in a detention center for months and months anyway. But if the person's eligible to come back to the US on a visa, that's not an enforceable promise. You can't like just have some executive branch agency having them sign up their right to come back if they're married to a citizen and the citizen wants to sponsor them. So it's just not really enforceable if they sign that. If they actually get deported, though, they're not allowed to come back to the US without the permission of the US government. They have to apply for a waiver of deportation. It is possible to get those, but it takes years. So the people who are agreeing to be deported, who are married to Americans, are in for a long haul where they're going to have to apply for a visa, get a waiver, pay thousands of dollars to a lawyer. And a lot of times people figure this out, and that's why they're not self-deporting because they realize they're eligible for a green card if they stay in America. Whereas if they agree to be self-deport, they're going to take it's going to take them years to get back. And I have talked to a number of Alaskans who agreed to the self-deportation thing, and now they're regretting it because their spouse is in a foreign country, and it's going to take them probably 4 or 5 years to get them back because they agreed to be deported, and now they're going to have to get waivers to come back, and it's going to be a big mess to come back.
What if they ask them to sign something, but they don't speak English? We had that happen here.
Right. Yeah, they do that all the time. And in fact, the case that I was telling you about, in that particular case, the agents came up to the Venezuelan guy and they made him sign a bunch of stuff that he didn't understand. And they didn't translate any of it to him. And in fact, they lied to him about what he was signing. In one case, they had him sign that he had been served with a document 2 months before and he hadn't, or 2 weeks before, and he hadn't been served with it 2 weeks before. They were doctoring the certificate of service on the document. So it's a really big problem. And if there's one thing you can get out as a message to people, it's don't just sign things if you don't understand them. Tell the agent you don't want to sign the thing and ask the agent to let you talk to a lawyer or an interpreter before you sign things, because I've seen people sign some pretty crazy things. Sometimes the agents will type up a statement that the person violated immigration law or committed a crime and have them sign it, and it's not true. So you got to be really careful. You just never sign anything if you don't understand it. They can always write refuse to sign on the form if they can't get you to sign it. So that's better than signing something you don't understand.
Thank you. How do the rights and treatment of detainees change when shifted out of ICE custody to another agency, such as Border Patrol?
Okay, well, it's not that their rights change, it's that the conditions change often depending on what detention center they're in. And they're still almost always in DHS custody because Border Patrol is part of Department of Homeland Security. But the conditions change a lot depending on what facility they're in. And a lot of the facilities are just terrible. There's terrible conditions in a lot of them. The death rate is way up among immigration detainees. That's something that's been documented recently that should concern people. There's a 19-year-old who just died a couple days ago in ICE custody in the lower 48, and they're claiming he committed suicide. And there have been a couple of cases where they claim somebody committed suicide, and it turned out they were actually strangled by the guards at the detention center. And it's been in the news that there was one person they determined was a homicide by asphyxiation, not a suicide, but the DHS people have been claiming he committed suicide, and it turned out he was actually apparently strangled by the guards at the detention facility. So the conditions in these facilities are often really terrible. There's a lot of news stories about that. People have been doing inspections of them. And my client, the Venezuelan I told you about, came back and he just told me the conditions were really, really, really horrible. They don't provide a lot of medical care. He said there were bugs everywhere. The food was terrible. In fact, the first thing he did when he got out of detention was go to a restaurant with his spouse to eat some decent food because he'd lost weight and, was just kind of bad physical condition after being in detention with DHS for so long. And again, this is a for-profit situation, so they're not incentivized to provide a lot of great food to the detainees because that's going to cost money, and they want to make a profit, so they're just kind of doing the minimum that's required.
Um, is there any kind of requirement, like they're contractors or something, right? So are they required to
Right.
provide like how many people per room or food or anything like that?
Well, officially, there are detention standards that were agreed to, but they're not being enforced at the moment. In fact, the Homeland Security Secretary used to say all the time that people are being provided, great medical care and everything. What is well known now is that they're not enforcing the detention standards that are officially supposed to govern. And it's because they can't. I mean, there's too many people there. They don't have beds for people, so they're having people sleep on floors. Um, they don't have enough food, so they're not feeding people sometimes. There are officially written detention standards, which you can find on the internet, but they're just not enforcing them at the moment.
Thank you. If a 16-year-old who was arrested by ICE with other family members was handcuffed and separated from his mother for 30 minutes, were his rights violated?
I think you're asking about a specific case, and assuming that those facts are correct, and I don't know if they are or not because I wasn't involved in that particular case, but it could violate a whole bunch of rules for that to happen. Yeah, but again, I don't know about. I only know what I read in the newspaper about that case. So the default rule though is right now they're just violating lots of people's rights. I mean, it's not just teenagers, it's adults who are having their rights violated. I had a case last year under the Trump administration in Anchorage where they arrested somebody. The arrest was unlawful, a warrantless arrest. They lied and claimed the person had failed to report for a check-in with ICE. It was a lie. It wasn't true, but they said that was the reason why they were arresting him because he allegedly hadn't reported in for a check-in. At the scene of the arrest, they handcuffed the guy. He had a wallet. Okay. Now, I used to be a police officer, and I know if you arrest somebody and they have a wallet, you're supposed to secure their wallet and bring it with you when you arrest them. The agents told me that they threw his wallet on the ground, or they left it at the scene of the arrest, or they, quote, gave it to his friend, or they left it in the car when they arrested him. But the fact of the matter was, when he finally got released on a petition of habeas corpus, his documents were missing, his key important documents. And I went to ICE and asked him for him, and they couldn't find him anywhere. They didn't know where they were. They made up all these different excuses. And like I said, told me that they left him at the scene of the arrest, which, makes no sense. Why would you leave the guy's important documents at the scene of the arrest? But this is the kind of stuff that's going on. And I don't know, again, the circumstances. Maybe they thought the teenager was like an adult or something, who knows? But there's all sorts of lawless behavior and constitutional rights violations going on right now. It's well known in the legal community that this is happening. There's lawsuits all over the country about it. There aren't any specific lawsuits that I'm aware of in Alaska, except for like habeas corpus cases over the practices happening in Alaska. But a lot of the stuff that they're doing right now is constitutional rights violations, and it's just happening like all the time. But the agents are not being trained properly, or if they have been trained properly, they're just violating the rules because they can get away with it. So I tend to default on the idea that they probably haven't been trained, because they're not getting any supervision anymore by people who are familiar with constitutional rights. And I do know some of the agents, and personally, I know a couple of them. They're nice people, but they don't seem to be following the law anymore. And what I've been told by one person who works for them is that they're just following orders. And I asked him why they're targeting certain people, and he said orders. And I said, well, what you're doing is illegal. Why are you doing it? And he said orders. So, they got orders to break the law. That's what they're doing.
Okay, so other than to get elected, what is the advantage to Trump or the USA to deporting so many when over 70% of America opposes what Trump is doing?
Well, I think they think that this is a winning electoral issue for them. I mean, it was for Trump. I mean, he won election because he said he was going to do mass deportation. This was his number one issue. And it resonated with a lot of Americans. There's a lot of Americans who think that immigration is out of control and there's too many illegal immigrants in the country and they should all be deported. If you talk to Trump supporters, they'll say that. Some people who voted for him, are happy with what's going on. I've heard the number 70% are against it, and I think the tide is turning, but a lot of Americans were applauding the idea of mass deportation right around an election time. They thought that we had been lax on border security and it was hurting our country. Again, a lot of this was due to lies. People were going around claiming that Biden had let millions of criminals into the country. This is absolutely not true. And it's true that Biden had let a lot of people apply for asylum, and he had let a lot of people into the country on parole, like Ukrainians and Venezuelans and Cubans. But Biden had been doing that because he was trying to fix a broken system. He just fixed it in a way that he couldn't fight back against the 30-second sound bites of his opponent, or Harris's opponent eventually. But and Trump just told a lot of lies. He said criminals and terrorists were being allowed into the country. I don't know of any instance where Obama or Biden knowingly let a criminal or a terrorist into the country. They were screening people who were being allowed in. Some people did slip in, but they weren't doing it on purpose. And criminals got into the country under Trump previously. In fact, we had a notorious case in Alaska involving a South African immigrant who was a horrible murderer. He's doing time in 226 years in jail right now. And Trump made the guy a citizen while he was murdering Alaska women. It's the Brian Stephen Smith case you probably heard about. He was an immigrant from South Africa, a white guy, and Trump made him a citizen under Trump's first administration. Right about the time he was murdering Alaska women, he was sworn in as a United States citizen under the Trump administration. I never heard Biden blame Trump for that. I never heard Harris blame Trump for that. But, if Biden had done that, Trump would be trumpeting it all over Fox News that, Biden had made a notorious murderer into a citizen of the United States. So that's just one example I give you, but the prior presidents weren't knowingly trying to import criminals and terrorists into the country. They were trying to fix immigration problems that were created by a mass wave of dispossessed people all around the globe created by worldwide conflicts. And it is hurting our country right now, what we're doing. I mean, we're just losing credibility all around the world. We're losing our workforce. We're losing American citizens' family members. We're denying asylum to people that deserve it, and many people are going to get killed when they go back. We deport them back. We've already deported back some people who have been killed after we deported them. I'm not sure if you heard those news stories, but there have been some news stories about deportations to Haiti, where right after we deported the people, they were murdered in Haiti. And so eventually this is all going to come out. It's not making our country look like the land of liberty at all. It's making us look like a totalitarian country that's extremely scared of the source of our strength, which has been immigrants. And on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I hope people will go back and read it again and think about it, because we revolted against King George in large part because of policies like this. And it's ironic that 250 years later we're doing it again. It makes no sense.
Does the Department of Corrections have a special agreement different than the 286G of law enforcement?
Yeah, it's a different type of agreement. So they have an actual contract with Department of Homeland Security, which you can read on the internet. I believe some Alaska legislators held a hearing and they made it public. And they have a contract that explains that because ICE doesn't have a detention facility in Alaska, they can use Department of Corrections facilities. But there's a bunch of rules that they're supposed to follow. And they don't always follow them, I have found out, but there is a written contract that DOC is supposed to follow when they detain people based on immigration charges. And again, they're civil detainees, so they're not supposed to be treated like criminals. They haven't committed any crime. They're being deported because they maybe didn't file the paperwork on time or they applied for asylum, and DHS has now changed the rules and decided they want to detain people who applied for asylum. So DOC is supposed to follow the rules of the contract, and it specifies how much they get paid and what the conditions are and what the rules are about what DOC is supposed to provide. I understand from talking to folks at the ACLU that DOC has not been following the rules all the time, but I don't have personal knowledge of all the violations that are going on. I just know I have read the contract and I can see why people are concerned because it doesn't look like Anchorage Correctional Center, for example, doesn't seem to be complying fully with the terms of the contract that they signed with DHS.
Thank you. This question takes a little right-hand turn here, but what's your opinion on Alaska turning over voter info to the DOJ?
I thought that was a pretty bad idea. And again, this is getting into the politics of it. So President Trump made a big deal out of the fact that he thought there were a lot of people voting who shouldn't be voting. And he thought there were a lot of illegal immigrants voting who were apparently going to swing the election to Biden way back when. None of this is true. It's not based on data. The incidence of non-citizens voting is really, 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 really tiny. But one of the things that's interesting about Alaska is that we do have a problem in Alaska with the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Division of Elections signing up people to vote who aren't eligible to vote. Okay, and it's not a huge problem. I think it's a few hundred people. But a bunch of Ukrainians who came in on parole got signed up to vote at the DMV because they went down to give them an update on their address or they tried to apply for a driver's license. And the DMV workers, for whatever reason, decided they were US citizens and registered them to vote, even though the Ukrainians told them they weren't US citizens. This has also happened to a whole bunch of other people in Alaska. The Trump administration has made a big deal out of wanting to prosecute people who registered to vote or voted if they're not qualified to register to vote or vote. And that's the reason why they were asking the states to turn over this data. What they planned to do with the data was to mine it to try to find people who are not American citizens who may have registered to vote or voted. And ironically, under Nancy Dahlstrom, the DMV was signing up a bunch of people who weren't citizens in order to vote. And Division of Elections was registering people against their will and often without their knowledge. And now the state has turned that data over to the federal government, presumably to try to prosecute these people, even though it's the state's fault. They also turned over all the private data of all of us. My data apparently has gone over to the federal government, and I don't imagine the federal government has good intentions what they're going to do with this data. They're probably going to give it to private contractors to analyze, and who knows what's going to happen. But I thought it was a mistake for the state to do that. It showed to me that they really didn't understand what was going on, and they're going to probably hurt some Alaskans. I do have a client who is a green card holder. Actually, I have two clients who are green card holders, and they've been in the news. They were registered to vote by the state of Alaska at the Department of Motor Vehicles without their knowledge, and they had no idea the state was going to do this. They didn't sign a voter registration form. What the DMV did was they took their change of address form, which they had signed with a pen, and they electronically reproduced the signature and put it on an voter registration form. And then the DMV or the Division of Elections, we don't know sure which one, checked that they were US citizens on the form and registered them to vote. Their data has now been turned over to the federal government. And I don't know why the federal government would want that data other than to maybe bring charges against them. It's scary to me that the Division of Elections can make mistakes like this and then admit to the mistakes by turning the data over to the federal government so people can be prosecuted. I wish they hadn't done that, and I thought they should have thought through it a little bit more before turning the data over, but it is what it is.
Thank you, Margaret. That was our last question, but we just want to let you know how much we appreciate you being here today. It's been so amazing.
Okay, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm actually working at the office today on some immigration cases, so couldn't take the several hour drive down there and back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, oh, yep. Okay. Yep.
Anyway, thank you for listening to me, and I'm sorry I've been long-winded. I think we're almost out of time, so if there's no other questions, I want to thank you again for inviting me, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.
Yeah, thank you. You have not been long-winded at all. It's been amazing. And we could probably sit here for hours and listen to all the things that you have to say.
Okay, well, if anybody has any follow-up, I did put my email in the at the end there, and you're welcome. If you need documentation of anything that I said, I'm welcome. You're welcome to email me, and I'll
Thank you so
provide
much. And
documentation. Sometimes people are
also
like,
this
"Oh, I
recording will
can't
be,
believe that." People are like, "I can't believe that that's true. Can you provide me with documentation?" And I'm happy to do that if you want.
awesome. Thank you so much, Margaret.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.